Give it all you got, no hesitating. You've been waiting all your life. This is your moment. This is your moment in time. This is your moment. This is your moment to shine, to shine, to shine. So shine on. And every time you hit the wall, remember you can have it all, even the mighty fall. It's closer than it's ever been, and now it's more than just a win. It's where your life begins, yeah. There's no holding back, no overthinking. You've been reaching all your life. This is your moment. This is your moment in time. This is your moment. This is your moment to shine, to shine, to shine. This is your moment. You got to give it all that you got. Don't hesitate and don't ever stop. You spent a lifetime waiting for this day. This is your moment. Now's not the time for you to hold back. Don't overthink, it's time to react. The moment has come, don't let it slip away, away, away. It's closer than it's ever been, and now it's more than just a win. It's where your life begins. You've tamed the voices in your head. You've put your courage to the test. Laid all your doubts to rest. Your mind is clearer than before. Your heart is full and wanting more. Your future's at the door. Give it all you got, no hesitating. You've been waiting all your...
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Samanthropolitics, a show where we talk about global politics and women's rights. Obviously, we are getting close to the United States election, and things are a little bit crazy right now. We're going to be talking about an issue that is kind of a rabbit hole, I'm not going to lie, of domestic terrorism, white supremacy, violent extremism today. And what's staggering is the amount that it has grown in the last 10 years or so. So, one thing that was, has been really hard for the US government, and this was, even under Obama, was to reorient itself from seeing Islamic terrorism as the main threat. Like we had Bush in the Iraq War talking about the axis of evil and this enemy that was always perpetrated as like this other, like the guys with the the turbans and the women with hijabs and kind of this very kind of convenient external enemy that subscribes to this religious ideology. And all of our American, frankly, spending and attention went to fighting radical Islamic extremism. But what's happened, especially with the rise of Trump, is that domestic terror attacks have far exceeded Islamic terrorism attacks. But the funding and the attention has not been reallocated to domestic terrorism as it should have been and should be now. So just for a little bit of data, the Center for Investigative Reporting found that in the last 9 years, there were nearly twice as many attacks perpetrated or attempted by right-wing extremists, 115, compared to those identified as Islamic domestic terrorism, 63. Also, the right-wing extremist attacks were far more deadly. In fact, only 13% of Islamist cases caused fatalities. By contrast, nearly a third of attacks committed by right-wing extremists involve fatalities. What's also interesting, too, is sometimes in that data of right-wing extremists, the mass murderers aren't necessarily counted. So this is another big problem with looking at and approaching right-wing extremism and domestic terrorism is that, you know, that these people don't necessarily say, I am part of, like, the Michigan guys that we talked about last week. I am part of the Wild Wolverines. I can never remember their name because it's just so stupid. It's not like, oh, he's in Al-Qaeda, therefore he's an Islamic terrorist. It's not as clear cut as that. A lot of the people that commit these attacks, they're not part of one specific group that we can say, oh, they're connected to this particular radical far right group. So, it took years. So another thing that I want to talk about is the fact that they're 92% male and 51% are white. And so I showed you last week that really lovely photo of the guys who were the Gretchen Whitmer peeps. Where did they go? Okay, of course now I can't find it. But how they're all white men. And so the majority of people who commit these crimes are white men. So there's something that we have to look at there in terms of why are they always men? So in a few minutes, after we talk a little bit more about the updates and what's going on in the United States, I'm really excited to have one of my, I don't even want to say he's one of my favorite people, but one of the most, I think, innovative people that I've ever met in terms of how he is recreating the concepts of masculinity in the most amazing way possible, Gary Barker. But before I bring him in, I just want to go over a couple more things with regards to domestic terrorism in the US and where exactly we're at. So, I'm not sure if anyone saw, and I don't think Trump saw, which is the funniest part. So I was a little scared to talk about this because I think he might not have actually know what DHS is actually doing. But October of right now, Department of Homeland Security's Homeland Threat Assessment came out. And it's basically a report that looks at, like, what are the major threats to our national security? Guess what? Not Islamic terrorism. The report says, and I quote, the primary terrorist threat inside the United States will stem from lone offenders and small cells of individuals, including domestic violent extremists and foreign terrorist-inspired homegrown violent extremists. However, they specifically say, among the domestic violent extremists, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically white supremacist extremists, will remain the most persistent and lethal threat to our homeland. So, newsflash, Antifa, not our biggest threat. DHS says it themselves. It's not Antifa. It is white supremacists. That is the threat. Furthermore, that's a little bit scary, is they say in this report that some domestic violent extremists and other violent actors may target events related to the 2020 presidential campaigns, the election itself, election results, or the post-election period. Such actors can mobilize quickly to threaten or engage in violence. So one of the things we're now talking about as the election gets closer is what happens if Trump loses? Like, what happens if he loses in a landslide? He's already told in the first debate the Proud Boys to stand by and stand down and basically get ready, with the Proud Boys took as like a rallying call to, get themselves ready for war. And so the fact that DHS, which is really looking at intelligence, they're not creating this out of thin air. They're using tons and tons and tons of data and analytics and the millions of people that, or the millions of dollars that we spend hiring people to look into intelligence. If they're saying that there's this possibility, this is not a joke. Like, this is real. Like, there's probably going to be violence if Trump loses. Which is pretty terrifying to me. And it's not going to be Antifa. It's going to be white supremacists. Furthermore, since 2018, white supremacists have conducted more lethal attacks in the United States than any other domestic violence excuse me, not domestic violence, domestic violent extremist movement. 2019 was the most lethal year for domestic violent extremism in the United States since 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing. That is staggering. And anybody who says that that's not related to Trump and that's not related to the ideologies that he promotes, like, hating on Latinos. You saw explicitly that the guy who shot up the El Paso Walmart was saying that there was going to be a Hispanic invasion that was clearly brought about by Trump. Is just doesn't make any sense. There's also been a drastic rise in hate crimes. So let's look at the graph of white supremacist crimes. All right, so you can see here. Look, so the white supremacist extremists are in blue. And then this is the homegrown violent extremists, so those people that might be inspired by Al Qaeda or ISIS or something like that. And then all other forms of domestic violent extremism, which you could say is maybe Antifa. So look at this. Do, 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 do. And then look at this. And look at this. Like, white supremacist extremism is terrifying. And it is on the rise. And this is like the scariest part. It's kind of, I feel like America sometimes is like this apple that's like rotting at its core, but like nobody knows that the core is rotting. And how do you deal with this? And I'm super excited to have Gary here to help me talk through some of these things, because it can feel pretty overwhelming. So Trump, in the first debate, he basically said, he said this thing about the Proud Boys, and how they should stand by and stand down. Got huge backlash for not disavowing white supremacists. So in debate number 2, it wasn't a debate. Trump, yes, just so ridiculous, was diagnosed with COVID a day after the last debate. So they were going to have a virtual debate, but Trump can't stand the idea of himself being muted. So he insisted instead on having his own town hall where he could have a big, he could be the center of attention because he couldn't stand to be muted. And Savannah Guthrie actually did a really good job in pressing him, even though watch at the end of the video what he calls her, because it literally makes my blood boil. So let's watch what he said last night about so he did condemn white supremacists, kind of, but then he went on a rant about the left wing. And then let's watch what he says about QAnon, which is the inspiration behind a lot of these far right attacks. Okay. Alright. Come on, YouTube. Work with me. All right. All right. Hopefully everyone can hear it, even though it's not showing for some weird reason.
Always start off with a
there we go.
question. You didn't ask Joe Biden whether or not he denounces Antifa. I watched him on the same basic show with Lester Holt, and he was asking questions like Biden was a child.
So this is a little bit of a dodge. We were supposed to, as mentioned, be watching you on a debate stage right now. We're not doing that, so let's clear up a few things from the last one. You were asked point blank to denounce white supremacy. In the moment, you didn't. You asked some follow-up questions. Who specifically? A couple of days later, on a different show, you denounced white supremacy.
No,
My question to you is,
you've done this to me and everybody.
Why does it seem like
I denounced white supremacy? Okay,
you did 2 days later.
I denounced white supremacy for years, but you always do it. You always start off with a question. You didn't ask Joe Biden whether or not he denounces Antifa. I watched him on the same basic show with Lester Holt, and he was asking questions like Biden was a child.
So this is a little bit of a dodge.
Are you listening? I denounce white supremacy.
Okay.
What's your next question?
Do you feel, it feels sometimes you're hesitant to do so, like you wait a beat.
Here we go again. Every time, in fact, my people came, I'm sure they'll ask you the white supremacy question. I denounce white supremacy.
Okay.
And frankly, you want to know something? I denounce Antifa, and I denounce these people on the left that are burning down our cities that are run by Democrats who don't know what they're doing.
While we're denouncing, let me ask you about QAnon. It is this theory that Democrats are a satanic pedophile ring and that you are the savior of that. Now, can you just once and for all state that that is completely not true and that disavow QAnon in its entirety?
I know nothing about QAnon.
I just told you.
I know very little. You told me, but what you tell me doesn't necessarily make it fact. I hate to say that. I know nothing about it. I do know they are very much against pedophilia. They fight it very hard, but I know nothing about it.
They believe it is a satanic cult run by the deep state.
Study the subject. I'll tell you what I do know about. I know about Antifa, and I know about the radical left, and I know how violent they are and how vicious they are, and I know how they're burning down cities run by Democrats, not run by Republicans.
Republican Senator Ben Sass said, quote, QAnon is nuts, and real leaders call conspiracy theories conspiracy theories.
He may be
Why
right.
not just say it's crazy and not true?
He may be right. I just don't know about QAnon.
You do know.
I don't know. No, I don't know. I don't know.
Let me ask you another thing.
Let's waste a whole show. You start off with white supremacy, I denounce it. You start off with something else. Let's go. Keep asking me these questions.
I do have one more in this vein.
Let me just tell you, what I do hear about it is they are very strongly against pedophilia. And I agree with that. I mean, I do agree with that, and I agree with it very strongly.
But there's not a satanic pedophile cult being run by.
I have no idea. I know nothing about that.
You don't know that? Okay.
No, I don't know that. Neither do you know that.
Okay, just this week you retweeted.
Why aren't you asking me about Antifa? Why aren't you asking me about the radical left?
Because you're
why
volunteering
aren't you asking Joe Biden questions about why doesn't he condemn Antifa? Why does he say it doesn't exist?
Because you're here before me.
No, excuse me. That's so cute. Antifa exists. They're vicious, they're violent, they kill people, and they're burning down our cities. And they happen to be radical left.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out
our YouTube
channel. Subscribe.
So Trump clearly did not read the Department of Homeland Security's October threat assessment report. And, you know, the thing that makes my blood boil when he says, so cute. I literally want to die. I just can't. As if he's like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. You're just like this blonde woman. You're just cute. That just made my blood freaking boil. He's so condescending towards women. It is unfreaking believable. So, you know, the other thing that's really upsetting too is that the 87 people killed by far-right terrorists over the first 3 Trump years, 145 people killed by far-right terrorists. If we include the 58 killed in the shooting rampage in Las Vegas by that Looney Tune, far outstripped the 17 killed by Islamists, or the 4 killed by left-wing extremists. So he's going, yeah, white supremacist. 145. Like, I don't even, like, there's no comparison. Like, the threat, he's making this whole Antifa threat up. So I have a lot more to say about this, but I think I'm going to just try to weave it into the conversation with Gary, because Gary knows a lot about this stuff. So without further ado, I'm just going to give you a little introduction to Gary. So, Gary Barker is a leading global voice in engaging men and boys in advancing gender equality and positive masculinities. He's the CEO and founder of Promundo, which has worked for 20 years in more than 40 countries. It began in low income areas of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, working with former gang members or young men who were apt to be recruited into gangs. Now, their approaches have been incorporated into ministries of health and education around the world. Gary is also the co founder of Men Care, a global campaign working in 45 countries to promote men's involvement as caregivers, and the co founder of Men Engage, a global alliance of more than 700 NGOs, which they advocate for gender equality. He co created and leads the Images Survey, the largest ever survey of men's attitudes and behaviors related to violence, fatherhood, and gender equality. He's also a co-author of the 2015 and 2017 State of the World's Fathers reports. That'll be interesting to see the next report with COVID. And he's advised the UN, the World Bank, national governments, international foundations, and corporations on strategies to engage men and boys in promoting gender equality. In 2017, he was named by Apolitical as one of the 20 most influential people in gender policy around the world. He's an Ashoka Fellow and received the Voices of Solidarity Award from Vital Voices for his work, and holds a PhD in developmental psychology. So, Gary, bringing you in.
Hey, Samantha, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for being here with me.
Thanks for having me. It's Friday, though. To have to re-listen to Trump's ranting last night doesn't feel like a way to usher in the weekend. But anyway,
Yeah.
we'll go.
So, let's just start there. I mean, Trump is the epitome of toxic masculinity. And you say something that I really found interesting in an article about reflecting on Trump, and you said, I continue to see the frightened guy behind the facade. Meaning that there's something going on with Trump besides just the fact that he's a jerk. What's your perception of him?
I mean, yeah, we can do a lot of armchair psychologist, analysis of, but he's got this constant need to be liked. We know a lot about his childhood and his, frankly, bullying by his father and sent off to a military academy when he was young, which is all about, right, before dad having to show that he's a real man. He's got, relationships with his brother and all that kind of stuff going on. So clearly, we've seen from his career early on that he operates as a bully. Only now he's got the world's most powerful nation behind him. This bully style has continued.
Is that the definition of the bully pulpit, Gary?
Exactly.
Now I know.
Less than figurative. It's real.
Yeah.
And I mean, we have to, hey, whatever the flaws of the Electoral College, he got voted for. He got voted into office. So he's also really, really thoughtful in his use of his bullying approach. He's got a lot of folks lined up behind him. He did not invent these harmful ideas about manhood. He was raised in them, and he knows, kind of almost intuitively how to read an audience and feed it back to them. So, I mean, we try to do a lot of putting the blame in an individual, but there's a lot of anger to go around that he knows how to kind of, feel the fire in the room, throw some gasoline on it, whirl the fire on his thumb and throw it back. I mean, we have to be both frightened and amazed at how he can play on that.
Yeah.
But behind it, there's a lot of, I need to be loved all the time. I can't be critiqued. Clearly,
constant validation.
Constant validation. I mean, has he ever hired or had around him, a woman that he considers competent or that he's treated as competent? We can also see, how his relationships with women and how he treats women falling into that as well. That need to constantly put women down is a clear sign of insecurity. That's part of the, that there's a misogyny part, but there's also a fear part. He is afraid that he's going to be called out for being less than the ideal perfect man that no man is. So he's a textbook that we can kind of show what it means, but we also have to look at, he's really good at whipping it up.
Yeah. So I want to reflect on, I'm sure you know Michael Kimmel's book, Angry White Men, which came out
Yeah.
before Trump was elected. And, he really talks about how white men, these angry white men, have this sense of, the world is against them. The militant feminists, I guess I would be a militant feminist, which I find hilarious. The militant feminists are destroying every opportunity that they have. They're aggrieved. They, what does he say, that they want to restore, retrieve, and like reclaim what America's
Yeah.
supposed to be, and this racially pure nation. uh can you reflect on that a little bit? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Michael does a great job in that book of highlighting several things that are happening and, maybe have gotten worse even since the book came out, right? One is this sense of, what some folks have called gender vertigo, that lots of men are lost with what does it mean to be in a world that demands, and where women are demanding full equality at all spaces. A lot of men are confused by that. We've had then huge economic shifts in terms of how this country works in the economy, the shift to the gig economy, which was happening a long time. It wasn't just now, but the insecurity of employment. So if at one point a you know a white man with a high school education could be guaranteed a certain kind of blue collar job, protected by unions in terms of a decent wage and some decent benefits, and his income alone might be enough to support a household of 4 or 5.
Yeah.
Those days are long gone. They were only ever accessible by some men, particularly some white men in the country. But there's a sense that, and it's not even their fathers; it's more their grandfathers that may have had that livelihood. And a lot of men are kind of harking back to, oh, those were better days. Men were in charge. We knew that if we, did those 8 hours of work a day, we could come home and be guaranteed women waiting on us and kind of doing all the rest of the work. And we knew where to send our sons and daughters into the world. And didn't that seem simple? Now, that was the reality of maybe 25% of our country. But I think, what we've seen is a lot of anger about this, in an insecure world. Where am I? Where do I go? Where do I fit in this world? And I think it's easy for us to belittle men having this view, but I think we've got to do a lot more to understand where that anger is coming from and how we address it without throwing anger back. And I think that's been a huge challenge. And to look at, and where I think we also have to look at with empathy, is to look at how much that anger is eating up a lot of white men from the inside.
Yeah.
Let's look at what's happening in terms of men's mental health. Men are 3/4 of the suicides in this country, and it seems to be increasing. Now, obviously, men's anger is also turning to women. We know that every 1% of unemployment during COVID or any other time turns into about an increase in 0.5 to a full percent of men's violence against women.
Wow.
So obviously, women are paying the price for this in huge ways, but it's also turning into men's own health. We die on average 5 or 6 years earlier than women. Most of it self-imposed stuff. We can talk as well about, you talk about white extremism and domestic violent extremism. We have to look at the mass shooters.
Right. And I would argue that a lot of those mass shooters are domestic violent extremists.
Yeah. I mean, we don't necessarily call it that because they don't necessarily have a political cause always that's articulated. But it's definitely and often those are suicidal as well, because they know for the most part that they will be killed in a volley of bullets coming from the police.
Right.
So they haven't necessarily articulated a cause that goes with it. Sometimes yes, but there's also and Jonathan Metzl's book, really thoughtful on this, of dying of whiteness, which is essentially dying of male whiteness, talking about the voting patterns of men in Midwestern states, for example, being against affordable health care, even when they themselves are the ones most likely to suffer and die of chronic illnesses that they can't afford to get treatment for because they're against the very health insurance that would allow it.
So do they understand why? Do they understand that they're voting against their own interests, or do they? I've never really understood that.
That's the I mean, what is rational in this moment is really challenging. I mean, I think is there rationality in the sense of who you hang out with and who you socialize with? I think I think we have to look at, there's a lot of these voting patterns and the voting against your own interests that have to do with this sense that somebody else is benefiting and you're not.
Right.
Right? There's a huge amount of myth making, and that's where, QAnon has been, perhaps the quintessential space around saying there's always some apocryphal story of somewhere individuals of color, women, gay or lesbians who are taking advantage of systems that you're not getting the advantage of. And so you'd rather shoot down those systems than you would vote for them and get services that are good for you. And that's been, we can acknowledge Ronald Reagan as part of the making the whole myth of the welfare queen. So clearly there are individuals who take advantage of the system, but they're about that few. Compare those to the number of consulting firms working for the military who overbill or who make billions and millions for weapons that you could argue, that we could easily cut our military by about a third and still be the strongest military in the world 4 times over.
I was talking to a friend today, and we were talking about how there are so many military weapons that are made that we don't even use. We don't use them, but it's because they create jobs, and they cost billions of dollars, and we have, tanks sitting in some warehouse in California that are never going to see combat. Like, why can't we put that money into education, into reskilling the people that are doing those jobs, into how about being cybersecurity experts so they can investigate violent white extremism? I don't know anything. Being nurses,
and we know where a lot of those weapons end up, which is we've been handing a lot of them over to local police forces. We've had a steady militarization, and if you watch the police response, you've got small towns that have 20,000 inhabitants that maybe have one murder every 3 years, who've got SWAT forces.
I know.
Trained
ridiculous.
In SEAL tactics, frankly, right?
It's ridiculous.
So there are moments where we do need, in a response to a mass shooter, for example, where we need some good skills on the part of of police forces. But most of the time, we've stepped away from anything that looks at negotiation, community policing, talking individuals down, and gone to our exit tanks. In many cases, have gone to Tyler, Texas, and small towns around the country, who've got more weapons than they need as well.
Right. This over militarization of and what scares me too is the fact that it's not just the police forces, it's the fact that these domestic militias can get their hands on these weapons. I mean, even in our country, I was reading up on the Walmart killer in El Paso. I don't even remember how many guns he had. It was like 70 something. I mean, how are you able to purchase that many guns in America? I mean, it is crazy. Like, for all of the people say gun rights, okay, fine. Let people have one gun. Nobody needs 70 something guns. Like, I don't understand how that's legal. Like, I just, including automatic weapons, I don't understand how anyone who advocates for gun rights can say that is, you need that many weapons to protect your family. Nobody needs that many weapons.
Yeah, and you want to ask, you want to ask, what are you so afraid of?
Right.
What is what is it that's coming? So I just arrived today. My parents live in a small town outside of Austin, Texas. And just as you drive out of the airport, heading the Austin airport, heading east, there's a gun shop called Brothers in Arms.
Wow,
and they used to, just have, I love the name, right? You've got the, signs up for what they sell. Now what they have outside is a small missile, is what is their prop for calling you into the store.
Oh my God.
It's so pretty thinking. So, we could read all kinds of conversations about what is so small that they feel they need a phallic symbol that big. But we won't go there on Friday evening. But you do
overcompensating.
What are we so frightened of? And I think that partly we can fill in the blank of how Trump has filled in that space of creating this fear, right?
Right.
What we just listened to of him fanning the flames around, to listen to his words. If you don't walk up to, if you don't actually know people who live in Portland, or you don't watch other news, his depiction of America is that there's a civil war about to break out.
Right.
As opposed to mostly overwhelmingly peaceful encounters, and you've had a few nights of a few incidents.
Right, that he's turning
So,
into a
if
civil
you
war.
live in that media bubble, you can be convinced that Portland is in flames, and you better get your weaponry.
Yeah.
So that that's a huge challenge as well.
Yeah, that was the other thing that I,
Yeah.
looking at a white supremacy when I was doing all this research, is that they believe that we're in a state of emergency. The white race is under threat, especially white men, and they're protecting it from annihilation. And if anyone the Walmart killer wrote a manifesto where he's very lucid. I mean, he's actually not a bad writer. Like, his grammar's correct, but he specifically says, like, white people are under attack. There is a Hispanic invasion. He talks about mixed race marriages and how they're destroying the right race. And he says, this is why I see my actions as faultless, because this isn't an act of imperialism, but an act of preservation. Then he says, I am honored to head the fight to reclaim my country from destruction. So he's made himself to be like a military hero or something, that he's in his own private army, that he's got to act and he's got to do it soon because he's saving the white race, which obviously, I mean, embedded in that is very racist thinking that the white race is just like the Nazis, is way better than all these other races.
Yeah.
Just
to mention a little historical perspective, which, that shooting took place in a place called El Paso that has been Hispanic or affiliated with Spain and Mexico for longer than it's been affiliated with the US. This part of Texas that I'm in right now was part of a deliberate ethnic cleansing that we could call, it was part of Mexico. Stephen F. Austin deliberately brought in Anglos because he wanted to have a majority so that he could vote in Mexico's Congress at that point, and eventually have enough Anglos that he could get parts of Texas to separate from Mexico. So, to say, wait, who was here first? In the case of, who are you actually trying to expel? That Spanish was spoken, and not to mention indigenous languages, of course, spoken even before, but a little bit of a history lesson that at one point we might have taught in Texas schools. We certainly don't teach that piece of history now. Could be quite useful. Some indigenous groups in New Mexico, have T-shirts that they will sell in shops in Taos Pueblo and elsewhere that basically show old photos of indigenous leaders and saying, promoting Homeland Security for 500 years. That they were,
oh my gosh,
we're the invasion in their space, not they're the invasion in our space.
Interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the why men would join extremist groups. I mean, we know there's a lot of disaffected white men, but some of them are Trump voters, but not all of them are violent extremists. So you talk about, in this great report that you have for Promundo about men and violent extremism, you talk about individual, community, family factors and structural levels that contribute to the likelihood of recruitment into violent extremism. So let's start with individual. And I want to highlight one aspect that you say in the report. Research has shown that more than any other factor, support for violence against women is linked with support for violent extremism. That just blew me away. And we know the killer in the one of the shootings had a history of domestic abuse when he was in the Air Force, but it wasn't properly given to authorities, blah blah blah. Wow, why that connection?
Yeah, I mean, we have to be sure that we don't confuse sort of correlation with causality there.
Right.
But we do see a lot of, first off, men who abuse women, this is not at all to make an excuse for them, but typically have patterns of either being witnesses of violence at home. They often saw their father or another man use violence against their mother or a female caregiver, or they themselves were victims of violence or abuse growing up. That is never an excuse, but that does help us explain a lot. Traumatized individuals traumatize others.
Yeah.
And witnessing violence against your mother, witnessing violence in the household is a childhood trauma. And the common factor of men who want to carry out more lethal forms and other forms of violence often have childhood histories of being traumatized growing up. And so those are common risk factors of I was a witness, whether you were a witness or a survivor of violence when you were growing up.
Right. I remember looking at statistics in Latin America where there's these
Yep.
wild rates of femicide and seeing that, like, I can't even remember this. It was crazy stats about the number of men that were abused as children, and
Yeah.
looking at that cyclical link to then abuse later in life.
Exactly. So, we know that lots of men are watching, whether they're in some part of the manosphere. And we know there's lots of men, choose one of the pundits who kind of flame some of the fire of angry white manhood, whether, kind of the more dressed up, nice looking version of Jordan Peterson to some of the more, deep misogynistic stuff on men going their own way, for example. There's a lot of men watching that. It's a minority of those men who watch that who go on either to kill a female partner or stalk a woman or rape or join and use weapons in one of the violent groups. So what we think is one of the differences there is who you know, who you hang out with, a brother, a cousin, a peer group. You start hanging out at, fill in the blank at the space, the rifle range, the gun store, lots of other places. Lots of those places have nothing to do with those men. So again, it's a few places. There's a lot of gun sales where none of this stuff happened. There's a lot of gun stores where the guy's going in to buy a shotgun to go hunting. Absolutely fine. But it is often those smaller groups where you're socialized into, where you see other guys doing this as well, combined with, did you grow up with some degree of trauma that is festered and given voice and then echoed by, in this case, our commander-in-chief. All those things seem to go into which men. It is still a few men who do this, but it's a few men who cause a lot of harm. It is not just listening to QAnon one time that you go out and pick up a weapon and decide to join Proud Boys. There's a lot of stuff, and even lots of the Proud Boys are there with their guns to feel tough, but they're not likely to go off and do a mass shooting. So I think we've got to acknowledge that there's a lot of categories going on here. Those who seem to be most prone to doing things like we're going to, launch an attempt to kidnap a sitting governor, or to go up in the tower of a hotel and rain down hundreds of rounds, typically have some childhood trauma, some psychological issues that are going on at the same time. So it's usually all the above. We have to be really careful that it's usually never one single factor.
Now, this is something that is not in your paper about preventing violent extremism or combating violent extremism, but I find it incredibly interesting, and I wonder your perspective on it. So a new working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research finds that legalized abortion following Roe v. Wade in 1973 accounts for 45% of the decline in crime rate over the past 3 decades. This was first talked about in Freakonomics by Stephen Levitt, and the concept is basically that unwanted children have an acute sense of being unwanted, and they're more likely to grow up to commit a crime. They're also more likely to grow up in poverty, because if the mother couldn't afford to have the child and now she has the child. So is our we were talking about Amy Coney Barrett and how women are going to lose the right to choose. It's all a rights-based argument, but what if Roe v. Wade is overturned? Like, could we see an increase in crime in 20 years? Like,
yeah, I mean, I think these are you can run statistics and find lots of correlations. There's lots of other things going on. So, I'm a developmental psychologist, so I absolutely do believe that toxic early childhood environments lead to long-term consequences, whether it's incarceration, substance use, mental health issues, higher risk of suicide, domestic violence when you become an adult. All those things are true. I want to be really careful, though, that we don't. We care about reproductive rights for women, period. We don't need to show that there's any correlation with higher rates of crime or higher rates of men doing.
But do we? I mean, because the right doesn't seem to be convinced by this argument that a woman's right to choose is enough. Like, they don't care. That's not enough for the right.
I don't want to have to go down the pathway of, this is a way to keep unwanted children from being born, because that's also a dangerous pathway of, therefore, a child who was in a low-income household growing up where there was multiple stressors is labeled and made into a dangerous human being. So it's a slippery slope. Therefore, to say a child who was born to a single low income mother or who was unwanted at the time they were born, as if we don't have the chance later on to find a caring adult who can love that child like mad and nurture them into a caring human being who, who we want in the world. So it's a slippery way to make a connection. And I think it can be an interesting sort of conversation we can go down. But I think, what we have to say is we want every child who is born, if a mother decides to carry that pregnancy to term, we want that child to come into the world with access to childcare, with access to great early childhood education, with that household to have, access to secure housing and good employment and income support if for whatever reason they don't have those things, and to have healthcare and to have a good school. So, I think we also have to look at that correlation probably wouldn't hold up in Nordic countries because, children have access to that basic stuff. So it troubles me as an argument. I don't think we shouldn't need to go to that extreme to say women can decide about their body. Shut up.
I just feel like
got to do, massive macroeconomics analysis, econometrics to make that case. It should be clear.
Right.
Hands off your body,
I just feel like it's like, I love when I think it was Kamala Harris when she was like, have you ever, heard of, I always think about like, would men ever let women legislate that all men should have vasectomies?
For example, right?
They would lose their freaking minds.
Right?
Like if we had anything to say about their, I don't want to say it on television, but like, their parts and what they should do with them, they would literally probably start a war. I mean, like, but with women, it's okay. And going back to what we were talking about control and about like, women being in the household and women's proper role, is my really firm belief is that a lot of the anti-abortion stuff has to do with not wanting women to have social, economic, and political equality. And if you have kids, it's a lot harder to do that as a woman.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's again, the harking back to, and I think it's easy to, again, point our finger and be angry at angry men. But I think we have a lot of homework to do on our side, which is to say, how do we bring men into a world where women and men have equal rights and equal space and equal voice? And I think we've done a fantastic job. Well, we are doing a fantastic job of creating more voice and space for our daughters. And I think we've done a lot of drawing new scripts to say, you get to be everything you need and want to be in the world. I think we're not done clearly with that, doing that work. But I think, if we look internationally, if we look in the US, there's been a huge amount of attention to making the world safe, to holding up girls and women's voices in the world and saying, we believe in equality for you. We still got a lot of work, but we've started that space. I don't know that we've done the corollary work that says, this is what it means to be a man in the world, that you're not entitled to more voice than she is. You're not entitled to sex. You're not entitled to her work for you at home. You're not entitled to the last word at the board meeting. You're not entitled to the C-suite. You're in this world together with her. You're not competing just with half the world for that job. You're competing with the whole world, because that's what fairness looks like if we're competing for a job, right? And I don't think we've done the kind of work, the homework that needs to go upstream to say, boys, this is what equality looks like. We expect nothing less of you. In fact, we will accept nothing less of you. And just a little origin story. I mean, we called Promundo, our name comes from Brazilian Portuguese, which means for the world, which our expression was thinking about gender equality for the world. To think about gender equality as a public good for all of us.
I like that, gender equality as a public good for all of us.
As a public good for all of us. We all live better, and we've got data to back that up. That's less freakonomics. So a colleague, for example, in Norway, Øystein Holter, has looked at homicide rates by gender equality. Countries that have better gender equality have lower homicide rates. States in the US that have better gender equality, I don't think that's spurious as an association. because that one typically says there's a lot of other policies in place that make the world better for women. And when the world's better for women, it's typically better for all of us. So that's one that I like to hold up as a better Freakonomics. It seems less freaky and more intuitive. And it doesn't require us to kind of do backflips to say, therefore you need this. It seems pretty clear that the antidote to violent masculinity is caring masculinity.
Yeah.
So that argument in a Freakonomics column, I'll go for that one.
Well, and so if we talk about boys, and I remember you said this to me when Gary was at a conference I did of all women and Gary. You said we have to look at the factory in which boys are produced, or something along those lines. Yeah. But within that factory too, if we think about caregiving and household responsibilities, I was just coaching a woman yesterday, and she grew up in Senegal, and she said, my boys, I had to do all the household chores, and the boys got to run out and play. And you know what? I have a client from California who's said, guess what? I wasn't allowed to have dates in my room. I had a curfew and my brother didn't. My dad had to sit on all of my dates, but my brother didn't. So this concept of responsibility, and boys kind of feeling like they're entitled to do whatever they want, and girls always feeling like they have this kind of structure. That's something that I find interesting, is how early that starts, and it really has to do with parents, mothers and fathers.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, this notion that women's sexuality has to be protected as a good, that's the family honor, right? Because the fear is about that at its root, that, female sexuality has scared males, for a very long time. And that's, to me, that's part of the abortion issue as well, that men are frightened about women's sexuality, and somehow men's sexuality is, uncontrollable, and, can't be controlled, and men have a right to it, and consent is, something for wimps. And yet female sexuality just continues to scare us, and somehow we think our worth as men is measured by whether we're able to control the sexuality of women. And the very, very subtle ways that gets in there. Now, some of this, yes, we of course need to, if there are places where it is dangerous in terms of sexual assault and spaces to be in. But that is not about protecting women because we have to lock them in. That is about doing the hard work to make that space safe, and to teach sons about consent, and to make it clear there is never any reason for harassment, abuse, or sexual assault. That is on us as men to hold that issue up, rather than to say you've got to lock women in. And
right.
I think that we need to look at that most men don't want to talk about it in it.
I was reflecting the other day. I hadn't thought about it in years, but that in high school, this top would not have been legal because I'm showing my shoulders. No spaghetti straps. We could get sent home from school if our skirts were, a certain. And I didn't go to Catholic school. I went to public school. But it was like their argument was like, oh well, the boys are going to get distracted.
Yep.
That's your argument.
Meanwhile, while we're out playing on the tennis team, we take off our shirts. Guys can take off their shirts or whatever, right? And that somehow, the supposedly chaste women or other guys who like male bodies would never be distracted by those, right?
Right, of course.
Yeah, this notion that female sexuality can be somehow, passive and will sit over there, and male sexuality is out of control, as if we can't learn to understand, embrace our sexuality, make sense of it, think of it, have it be a force, that's positive, that we can, but that we also have to know how to make sense of and control ourselves and understand consent.
I wonder how much of it sometimes goes back to Adam and Eve, that even Adam was seduced by Eve, and he ruined everything.
Well, it's, there's rumors that might have been written by a patriarchal male way back when.
Shocking.
That story might have been told as part of a system to repress women. Yeah. I've heard.
I've been struggling. This is just a random reflection, but I've been really struggling with religion lately, because was reading like a passage from the Old Testament, and it was like about how I think it was like Lot, like there's a group of men that come to his house and they want to like take over his tavern, and so he offers them his like virgin daughter, and they gang rape her and basically murder her. And that's like okay. And I just and there's like multiple examples like that of like women just being treated as property, as like real estate and virginity, and it makes me, I don't know, like I identify as Jewish, but like that makes me not want to identify with the Old Testament anymore. I mean, to be being totally honest.
Yeah, where to start with that, right? I mean, I think at the same time there's um, our Abrahamic faiths, whether Judaism, Christianity, Islam. There's plenty in there, and they certainly reflect the patriarchal roots and moment they were written in. There's other passages in whichever part you pick out that are also an attempt to put to limit some of the extremes of misogyny and patriarchy of the time.
Mm,
So Jesus saying, "Don't stone the prostitute." Now we would call her a sex
right,
worker.
right, right, right.
Parts of Islam were about the protection of women who, before Muhammad came along, and some of the nomadic tribes in the Middle East were basically property that traded hands, and if you killed the husband, she became your concubine. So
Mm,
part of marriage was kind of the only social insurance that women had at the time. So some of what Muhammad was proposing was basically somewhat of protecting of women. And there's things you can find in the Old Testament of the Torah as well. But yeah, they were written in an extremely patriarchal time where women were second class, not even third class citizens. They were property of men. And there's a little bit of improvement along the way. In some passages you can find that temper the worst of
yeah.
patriarchy at the time. But no, they are not feminist treaties.
No, I mean, it's terrible. It's like the series
Yeah.
Unorthodox, and knowing like what Orthodox Jewish women go through, and like they're
Yeah.
basically baby makers. And
Yeah.
then, you have the Catholic Church where still only men can be priests. And then there's like all these priests that have been indicted in sexual abuse scandals, but then the
Yeah.
church is still against homosexuality. It's like so messed up. Like I just, and yet, like so many people, I mean, part of our far right system in the US is fueled by the church
Yeah.
and a lot of these teachings.
And I think in there's a lot of social justice that's found its meaning in the Abrahamic religions as well.
Mm,
There are feminists in the Middle East who find, a lot of their speaking out of injustices. They, can find support in the Quran. There's a lot of, the women's rights movements tied to more progressive wings of the Catholic Church, for example. Some of my first work in Brazil was with the women's ministry of the Catholic Church, the more
mm,
progressive wings coming out of liberation theology. That was, some of the most progressive wings of feminism found in certain parts of Latin America. So, any big religion has both its more extreme and certainly patriarchal roots. All three of these religions do. But there's also been spaces where, some nuns who have done some of the most progressive social justice work on land rights and sex worker rights and
mm.
HIV activism coming out of Latin America were done by some very progressive nuns and some priests along the way.
And then,
This is, out of the
yeah,
Jewish faith, some of the most progressive politics in this country. We can name a candidate who some of us would have liked to see
right,
more presidential.
they're not Orthodox, they're not
No,
Hasidics.
no, they're not. But they do find in their Jewish tradition aspects that are for social
Yeah,
justice.
no,
Yeah,
and Judaism is it's about giving tzedakah. It's about like
yeah,
my whole interest in the Syria crisis was about looking at, you know, at the genocide of the Jews and saying like we
yeah.
can't, like never again, we can't have this happen again. Um, and also, I mean, I think this is interesting too. I remember a professor of mine, Kimberly Tyden at Fletcher, wrote a piece about how the church is going back to men and violent extremism, has offered a really good way for young men to find a space of community and solidarity in the church that were once in extremism, and that because there's like this reverence for God, that's like the one place that it's like, okay, if they left us and they're in the church, we'll leave them alone. Like if they
Yeah.
leave us and they join a band, we're going to go get them. But if they went to the church, okay, we're all Catholic here, we love Jesus in Latin America, so that's okay. So I
Yeah.
find that really interesting. Did you see that? I mean, you started this in Brazil. Like, did you see religion as a big way to get out of violent extremism?
Well, yeah, I don't know if that. I mean, I want to be careful of doing too many parallels with gang members because the politics of gang involvement is typically a lot more around poverty than it
Hmm.
is necessarily given a political. There's, the armed men that Bolsonaro is giving voice to are typically those who look more like white supremacist violence in this country
Hmm.
than gang members. So, entering gangs was typically often a household facing extreme poverty, extreme hardship, typically multiple other traumas going on as well, and some kind of exposure to violence growing up, and typically, somebody in your peer network who recruited you in and that you had what they call disposition to be part of the gang. Typically, that disposition is because you had been traumatized as a child, a
Hmm.
victim of violence, or you had witnessed some horrible violence growing up. And, the psychological and biological impact of trauma meant that your threshold of using violence had lowered. So, how do we get boys out of that once there's been some amount of time that they've found camaraderie, they've found a sense of power, they've got income, typically single mother households where
Hmm.
his income keeps the family from food insecurity. He's bringing home money to buy the gas canister so mom can cook.
Hmm.
He's bringing home, the money that keeps mom from getting evicted from the small house or apartment that she's living in.
Hmm.
So, he's both saving the household, he's got access to income, he's got respect, he's got female companionship, all the above. How do we help guys get out? Multiple ways. Religion was one. It is one way that the gangs will say, okay, he's found God, but you had to show up, you had to be seen going to church. You couldn't just say it. You had to show some proof. The priest or the pastor had to say, yeah, I've
the
seen
the
Shwangwang.
priest was like an inside reporter
Yeah,
to the
you had to be
gangs.
showing, you couldn't be then saying, yeah, I'm going to the Baptist church and then you're getting drunk on Friday,
Yeah.
right? You had to show some consistency. Becoming a parent was another way out, becoming a father,
Oh, interesting.
in a close relationship with that child, um, a job. The other thing that evangelical churches were particularly good at is not only did they give you religion, they also got you a suit and a clean pair of pants and got you a job interview on Monday and
Hmm.
got you a haircut. So not just saving your soul, but also basically saying, I had a friend who works at this grocery store. They're looking at somebody to do this. Get a haircut. Don't wear shorts. You're going to show up for a job interview on Monday. We got the AA group that you're going to go to as well, because you've been drinking a lot of cachaça, and we know that's part of your problem as well. So they're pretty good at multiple services. They know how to do wraparound services for you. And typically at the next service you're going to on Sunday morning, they've got, oh, you should meet Mariana, and they're also doing matchmaking for you. So they're good. I think we have a lot to learn of what good social services can be like, of
Yeah.
offering you an identity, an interview for a job, companionship, company, a social network that says we got you. We can criticize lots of stuff they say, and we should. And certainly on gender, they're way off on gender equality. But they're really good at offering wraparound social services that
Hmm.
rarely are we as good in our programming.
Like, yeah, they're like a one-stop shop to,
Yeah,
get all
yeah,
those things done.
yeah,
So going going back to, oh, so this was another thing that I found really interesting, just because we're on the topic of religion, is that there's this perception that religion is a causal factor for violent extremism, especially with regards to the Middle East. And your report actually points out that religion's actually not a causal factor for violent extremism. And the report says, where is it? Equal respondents cited religion as a reason that they did not join extremist groups. So they're
yeah.
looking at Islam as a reason that they're actually not joining violence. So I think this is this flies in the face of everything the American media and narratives have taught us about Islam and about, people still have freaking heart attacks when there's a mosque built in their town. Were you surprised to find this out? And what are your thoughts on that?
No, not at all surprised. I mean, come on, the vast majority of, I mean, that would be like saying white extremism is associated with Protestant churches. The vast majority of men who are part of white extremist groups are part of Protestant churches. But I, flip that around and say the majority of men who go to either, some Protestant religion, or the majority of men who go to a mosque or would define themselves as Islam are not part of any armed group. So, I think it becomes a convenient narrative, just as you can say, those bad hombres and rapists from Mexico. The vast majority of men in Mexico do not rape. The vast majority are not involved in drug trafficking. These become the really simple things to hang and to put my tribe against yours.
Right.
And we've had an issue in the West since at least the Crusades that, Islam is somehow, that there's this global clash that's going on between Christianity, and usually we put Christianity and Judaism on one side against Islam. That fits into a very convenient Islamophobic narrative that has nothing to do with the vast majority of individuals across countries that are majority Islamic. It does not speak to what they think about the world.
Right.
In fact, our message makes that even worse. We have probably done more as a country because of our misguided policies to drive more men into extremist groups in the Middle East than we have to draw them out, because we've fueled that narrative.
Right.
And that really fuels how we talk in the world, and how our, particularly in this administration, subtle and not so subtle ways that we speak about Islam and about majority Muslim countries.
Remember the very beginning of the Trump administration when he blocked immigration? Was it immigration or even flights? I can't remember, from all those, Muslim majority countries.
It was visas.
Oh, visas. Like that was crazy. I mean, it sent such a message. And so I don't know if you've seen this, Gary, but I love Sacha Baron Cohen's "I Am America." Have you ever seen it?
I know of it, but I've not seen it.
Oh my God. So there's this episode where he goes to like a small town in America, and he basically goes up and he says, like, I am from the blah, 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 like, housing authority, like, and it's like a town hall meeting, and it's probably got all white people, and it's like probably 40 people in the room. It's like kind of middle America. And he's like, I'm excited to tell you about a new project. It's going to bring like 5,000 jobs to this town. It's going to create this much economic growth. It's going to revitalize Main Street. Like, who's in? And everyone's like, yeah, we're in. And he goes, announcing, and then he like takes the thing off the thing, and it's like, the Shalhassa Mosque. And like the whole room is like in arrears, like, a mosque? What? That's not allowed. And one guy actually says, we don't want like Muslims, we already got the N-word here. Like, like there's already its problem. But so it's like, how do we, me and you are in Washington, D.C., which is like this like pretty educated place where, I have Muslim friends, like, and I'm sure we do too, but like, how do you get that message out to middle America that really, I think, has gotten this perception of Muslim people as like the devil since 9/11, frankly.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that we'd have to do a big political economy discussion around how we've created, sort of a gradual stripping back of the guarantee of, or the promise of, adequate employment. We've, until affordable healthcare came along, we stripped away the possibility that you knew that you could, if you were working class, that you had access to health insurance.
Right.
I mean, the number of households in this country that are one illness away from, losing their housing, not being able to pay rent. Access to education. Look what's happened to the quality of education and how expensive a university education is in this country. And then we feed you with a steady narrative that says you're a loser if you don't have a job. If you can't consume all these things and have a certain lifestyle, you're a loser. And then, so then you come in. So it is funny, but it's a bit of a red herring, right? So you've got communities who feel like our livelihoods are hanging on by a thread. we don't see where we're not really sure where the next paycheck is coming from. And then you come in and do sort of a trick, bait and switch. And it shouldn't be considered a prize that somehow you're lucky enough to live in a small town, that maybe your mayor or your governor has been able to win this concession for you of these jobs coming into your community. We need to think about a state again that says, we've got to work to guarantee that you've got a livelihood, you've got a place to put your head at the end of the day,
Yeah.
you've got access to health care, and it shouldn't have to be on the whim or the luck or an opportunistic candidate coming through promising jobs.
Yeah.
So I do not at all condone that response, but I think you've got to look at what economic stress that man perceives himself as under. I'm not going to defend that his stupid racism, but
Right.
you have to say we've made this situation, this tinderbox, by pulling back anything of a welfare state. And we've given that whole idea of a welfare state, we've layered it with all kinds of negative connotations. And even in this election, we're seeing more of it, right? That if Biden believes in, if Biden and Harris promote the minimal of any kind of guarantee of a security net for individuals, they're labeled socialists. Um,
Right.
so that tinderbox existed. So, it's kind of a cheap trick for Sasha for him to go in and say that, because, we've got a population that feels on edge. We are
Right.
one paycheck away from bankruptcy, most households in this country.
But then going back to voting against your own interest, though, is that Trump's tax cuts have benefited the very
Yeah,
wealthy. They have
yeah,
not benefited middle income families.
yeah.
Most middle
No,
income families don't have lots of money in the stock market. They don't have
no,
lots of properties. Like our whole tax system, like the whole tax system of like kind of, prioritizing people with properties and giving them tax cuts. It doesn't benefit
yeah.
them. So like the
Well,
household median
yeah,
income hasn't gone up. Hasn't it like not gone up since like 1975? And now you have
yeah.
two people working.
Yep. Yeah, and that's the perfect myth that he's been able to sell. So yeah, and then add to that the if you take away resources from public education, what happens? You get stressed out teachers with less education than we'd like them to have. You get conservative groups that control the curriculum, so there's less critical thinking going on.
Like abstinence only education, my personal
For
favorite.
example. But even apart from that, you don't get even full stories of this country, of
Yeah.
what the kind of his ideology has taken over the school curriculum in many states and counties in the country. So then we raise our children to be not critical thinkers and not to get a broader education, that so they'd be able at that moment to have the critical thinking skills we'd want them to have.
Yeah. So one of my friends, we lost your
Sorry, ahead.
we lost your internet for 1 second. But no, one of my friends, Regan, is hysterical. He talks about moving from I think from Minnesota to the South, and he brought up the Civil War in one of his classes, and his teacher says to him, "Oh, Regan, don't you mean the War of Northern Aggression?" Like that's still being taught. Like
Yeah,
a teacher says that to somebody? Like
yeah,
that is wild. And like the fact that Confederate flags were finally banned from military bases, but like this Confederate flag, I mean, as soon as it's weird living in Washington D.C. because like as soon as you drive to like Harper's Ferry or something, like there's Confederate flags everywhere. It's like it's really freaky, and it's like, do you not understand that we are one nation, like indivisible? Like that's literally our pledge to allegiance. Like we are one nation. Like the Civil War was hundreds of years ago. Like get over it.
yeah,
It's and again, it's this like this pride issue of like, we can't admit that the South lost the war. Who cares who lost the war? Like I don't know. The Confederate stuff also just drives me totally bananas. Like
yeah,
Robert E. Lee Highway that you're driving on, and it's just like, what in the heck? So we have been talking for quite a while, but always feel like I could talk to you for a million years. You know, I want to just reflect quickly on like these particular men in Michigan who plotted to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, because I just remember seeing it when it first came out. It was just like, this is Looney Tune stuff. I mean, this is crazy. Like they want to instigate a civil war, like they're planning to kidnap the governor. I mean, and I know it's hard to say this like in a short period of time, but like how do you go from a guy who is just angry and pissed off because he can't provide for his family to plotting to kidnap Governor Whitmer?
Yeah. Yeah, what's that pathway? I mean, I've not seen profiles written up of the men, but what do we know about some of the others, Timothy McVeigh and some of the other stories of, and now we've got, QAnon and some of the dark spaces of, 4chan and 8chan and all the rest of where, yeah, just this kind of lethal mix and this just, misogynistic, racist, xenophobic mix of where you don't have others calling you out. You're not in a conversation where you've got to look others in the eye and look at their humanity, right? I think the challenge becomes they're typically loners. It's typically small groups. You are typically, your social group is that small universe. You are not bothering to stop and say, this doesn't match with reality.
Right.
There are individuals out there who fit the description you're talking about, who are human beings. And part of me looks as well, looking at those pictures of, the armed men in the state capitol next to the police who's there to guard him. And I'm thinking, why aren't there any conversations going on of, hey man, we got to work this out. This is crazy. I wanted to think like, have you not seen every Netflix picture, movie, or any Hollywood film ever? Whenever there are guns and angry men, by the end of the movie,
Everyone's
guns
dead.
are used by those angry men.
Yeah.
It is so clear that if we don't find ways, and if we just look at them like, look the other way, and they will somehow disappear from our sight. It is such a chronicle of a tragedy foretold. Like, why are we not finding ways that we reach out and engage?
Right. And it's because you can't solve all of this just by having FBI arrest domestic terror cells.
No.
Like you're already at the end of the line at that point.
Yep. Yep. And, of all it is a handful of men who are part of this, but a handful of men with guns can do a lot of harm and willingness to use them. The issue is how many other guys look up to them. And that's what we've seen in gang activity as well. It's never more than studies we did in favelas in Rio. It's never more than 1.5% of young men who ever did anything with gangs. And it's fewer than that who ever actually, carried guns and were active members. So it's a small number of men who are part of it. But a number of men that they inspire by saying, yeah, we're in favor of that. We'll look the other way when they cause harm. So, it seems like we missed lots of opportunities. And this is not to put it on the governor. This is to put it on lots and lots of folks to say, I want other men around these men. I want uncles and I want their aunts and I want their sisters going, hey, maybe you're going down the dark end. There's something here that you're going too far. And like, why weren't we having meaningful conversations there at the Capitol? It's one thing to say, hey, you shouldn't be able to carry weapons in here. Absolutely crazy that you can carry weapons in there. But to miss opportunities if they're hanging out, we've somehow got to be brave enough to have those conversations with them and say, let's talk about your grievances. Let's bring them up. Let's acknowledge what's happening with your livelihood, that you're so angry about this. And I've got to figure out what I can do. Now, to her credit, Governor Whitmer was talking about all that stuff. And Democrats have been trying to get the kind of protective, the kind of short-term economic support that we need in a moment like this. And this fits in. This is great for the Republicans because they can deny that stuff and say we can't afford it. And then that, of course, is fueling the very anger that they're also then, at least Trump is then sort of throwing gasoline at both ends of the fire.
Right, because people don't seem to understand that it's Republicans that are doing that.
Yeah. But I think the really tough part of us who are progressive is to say we can't lock them all away.
Yeah.
We've got to have conversations with them. I can't look away from QAnon and say, oh, I don't want to talk to my cousin who listens to that stuff. We need to find meaningful ways to have conversations and not just you're wrong and you're stupid.
Right.
And how can you believe that stuff?
Yeah.
We've got to find ways that we acknowledge that we see what the grievance is there. It doesn't mean I'm giving more support for your grievance, but it means to say, let's talk about them and let's figure out what we need to do to become a better country that finds a space and acknowledges you've got some
Right.
real grievances.
Well, and that's what's something that I find interesting too is that so when I think about like, okay, I want to change the country or I want to change a policy or I want to change a system, I think about government. I think about policy. I think about
Yeah.
writing to my congressperson. I think about running for office. But that the default seems to be I don't know, maybe they're not getting government education either to think that like they can change things on a government level, that that is possible, that they could have by organizing for change, they could influence a policy where Michigan, I don't know, gives a subsidy of X dollars to its businesses. Like why is like the default to violence? Like that's I'm just thinking about like the education or what I don't know. Like, why is there not thinking like, oh, we could change government policy? Am I just like a elitist liberal that I don't
Well, we've built a lot of the American myth on rather than diplomacy of sending our troops, right?
Right.
From
So it's the
the
militarization of
that that's not to blame the individuals who are in the military, but that is to say, we've decided that a lot of the problems that we go to solve are now, are about sending weapons and using force. The glorification that we do, the what was I reading about the number of shows in prime time that were, something like 2/3 were police procedurals or had something to do with police, and typically, exalting that we could resolve any social problem with good enough policing. So we've got a lot of weapons and a lot of devotion to military and police
I know.
responses to problems that are
How
social
many how
and
many how many
human,
movies have you seen that are about peace processes versus wars?
for example, right?
Have I don't think I've seen any. And there's amazing peace
Yeah,
processes out there. I mean, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South
yeah,
Africa, Ireland. I mean, I really don't understand how Richard Holbrooke's book To End a War has not been made into a movie because it's
yeah. I
incredible the
mean,
negotiation of the Dayton Accords, and yet there's
yeah,
war movie after war movie after, and it's so glorified and like
yeah,
romanticized, and I really do think it's like, and that contributes to men and their issues, right? And you say that at some point in the paper about militarization and how harmful that is to men.
yeah. Yeah, if that's the only path to kind of socially recognized manhood that we offer to boys and men in lots of spaces, that will be the space that they fill. And that holds whether it's, fragile states in Central and West Africa, and it holds in Kentucky. If that's the space that we offer and say, this is the manhood that we glorify, that will become a space that men go to.
Right.
If they don't have to just becoming millionaires, but they become other places to say there's lots of valuable, caring, connected ways to manhood that don't involve the use of harm and threat. And there's lots of folks in our military who abhor the direction that the Trump administration has taken it. There's a professional cadre of folks in the military who think that the military is the absolute last resort.
Right.
So we have to, be careful I want to be careful as we criticize the military to acknowledge the really honorable
No,
individuals
I
who
mean,
are
Mattis
trying to
said if we,
do
you know,
their
you
best.
give the State Department less money, that means we have to send more troops. I mean, it's like
Yeah,
it's putting us in harm's way. Like this should not be putting
yeah,
in troops should not be the first. And but frankly, neither should drone strikes. Like
yeah,
our participation with Saudi Arabia with no questions for years of giving them weapons and participating in these drone strikes in Yemen. This was also under Obama. Was a
yeah,
freaking nightmare. That was a
yeah.
disaster, and Yemen's been a huge breeding ground for terrorist recruitment.
Yeah, and that's been if somehow if we don't see it and if American troops are not involved, we think that our involvement is less lethal or that the blowback will be less. We've been doing that since, well, for a very long time of thinking, if we just send weapons to others, our hands are somehow clean and the blowback to us and the harm will be far less.
Right, right.
Um,
And the
yeah,
sanitization, I mean, it's so interesting,
yeah,
having military friends. I remember a pilot telling me, something about delivering a weapon. I'm like, oh, you mean you bombed an area? No, no,
yeah,
I delivered the weapon. Okay, like they give them this language to make it easier to kill, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's kind of sad.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I do think, and maybe that's a hopeful note to end on, which is, if depending on where you started in our conversation, you could come out thinking that men are inherently violent, um, when in fact it's a huge amount of work to turn men violent. Our default as human beings, male or female, is the care that we grew up with. Typically, that is where our power for caring and working together for good is far greater than our ability to blow ourselves up. And most men, whether in gangs or violent extremist groups or those who go on to carry out mass shootings or who kill a partner, there's a huge amount of trauma combined with other stuff that typically went in to make that man kill. And so I do think it's, and militaries have figured that out with how many men don't want to go in and pull the trigger.
Right.
Even in places, even in wars where it feels like there is a really good cause, most men, when looking another human being in the eye, do not want to kill them. So, it takes a huge amount of,
which is why drone strikes are so convenient.
Yeah. I mean, abusive drill sergeants, indoctrination, creating bands of brothers to, most soldiers tell us, I fight not because I really know what's going on in Afghanistan. I fight to protect the brother next to me that I'm worried what's going to happen to him. And then if we can sanitize it so you don't actually have to look at a human being at the other end, and they just look like a small figure on a screen that resembles a video game that you played 10 years ago, it becomes far easier to do than if you have to stand across from another human being and kill them. And I think that is important to remember, that our default as men is not violence, and that's really easy to forget.
Yeah. So this has been an amazing interview. We didn't even get to half of the questions I had because I just could talk to you for 9 million years. So important to engage men and boys when it comes to gender equality. How can people support? I saw on a panel the other day, a guy said, okay, what do men do? How do they support you if they're men watching this that are like, I agree with everything he said. How do I get involved? What do they do?
There's a lot of work out there at the moment to engage men as allies in this. Our website has some places. Talk to your sons about it. We have an initiative called the Global Boyhood Initiative. Some stuff in there to talk about your sons. We've got some stuff on our website called The Future of Manhood as well, how to have a conversation about healthy manhood. Go to Jackson Katz's website and look at his movie and have a conversation about it. Go to the Representation Project. Watch the film The Mask We Live In.
It's a great movie.
Have a conversation with boys and men about it. Go to A Call to Men. Some really useful stuff in there as well about how men can be part of. Donate to Planned Parenthood. Speak up for women's rights. Be an ally in women's reproductive rights. Be an involved father. Take a look at Dad 2.0, Fatherly. Lots of stuff out there for men on how to be good fathers. We're not, we don't have nearly as many resources behind us as some of the negative views out there, but there's a lot of places to go for, how to be our better selves. Movember doing some great work of getting men talking about self-care. All the above. As I list them, there's a damn lot of stuff happening out there. It's not kind of in your face the way that Brothers in Arms, right outside the Austin airport. They're
with
like
their
the
missile.
I saw.
Oh man. All right, Gary, this has been tremendous. I want to thank you so much for spending your Friday night talking about domestic terrorism and Trump and, real fun stuff with me. So
well, thanks for carrying on the cause, and I think we need to have these conversations and ask difficult questions. So I hope folks are watching and keep
and I keep thinking of
being brave enough to talk about it.
I keep thinking about another initiative by another Ashoka fellow, Ruth Ibegbunya. She started something called Roots in the UK, and it's to bring pro-Brexit and anti-Brexit people into basically civil dialogue conversations. And I think we need to have that not just between the police I think we need to have that between the Black Lives Matter movement and that could be fascinating and really amazing because both sides just have no idea what the other one came from, and
Yeah.
storytelling. Like there's so many conflict resolutions techniques you could
Yeah.
use to help these groups understand each other, but I don't know if there's anyone doing it in the US. Maybe.
I mean, some of our stuff in favelas in Rio was bringing some young men, many of them were fathers, bringing them together with their kids, or, together for a barbecue and a football match, a soccer match, together with police who were
Interesting.
men kind of like them, same race, often the same income class, majority of them fathers as well. And to kind of, I mean, to affirm our common humanity and to kind of go, wow, you don't have a tail and you don't have, a gun strapped to your shoulder, and it's not sort of, a permanent fixture in your body. And funny, you look just like me when you're wearing shorts and flip flops hanging out on a Saturday
Interesting.
afternoon.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, and to say that the state has to do all it, I think there's a lot of really small civic engagement activities like that we've got to be brave enough to kind of, get out. Well, now it's difficult because we need to wear masks and keep social distancing, but to find ways that we, when we resume life as normal, to find
Right.
ways that we step out of our screens. And it's a lot difficult. It's a lot harder to hate somebody if you look them in the eye and you break bread and have a coffee or a beer with them.
Yeah, totally.
Kind of obvious stuff. Yeah.
I absolutely agree. Well, thanks again, Gary.
Yeah. All right. Good
Take
weekend.
care. You too.
Yeah. Peace.
Wow. I just could talk to Gary for 9 million years because he's incredible. So I hope that, everyone was listening and got some of those great resources he talked about. A Call to Men, the movie A Mask You Live In, Jackson Katz has a new film. Gary's website, or his organization, is called Promundo. Promundoglobalorg is the website. And like we talked about, they're doing work in all these different countries. We didn't even talk about the work they're doing, but tremendous work around caregiving, around men and masculinities. They're also partnering now with all these brands who are doing advertisements about kind of creating new masculinities. They had a partnership with Axe that was really cool. So also support them. They're a nonprofit. Give them money, please. If you care about this movement, go to www.promundoglobalorg and give them money, and talk to your sons and fathers and your sons. And I love when moms will say, like, I want to raise a feminist son, and it's not just about fathers and how they approach their sons, it's also about mothers and how do you approach your sons and your daughters. So we're going to close up for tonight. Just want to say a couple things before we leave today. Guess what? We are voting on a new president, on senators, on, school boards, on a million things coming up in early November. Vote, 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 vote. If you haven't requested your absentee ballot, you are like almost too late. Go to your county, wherever you're registered, go to that county and go to request ballot. If you cannot figure out how to do it, call the Board of Elections in that particular county to which you are registered and tell them where you need your ballot sent. This is if you're absentee ballot or voting by mail. Also, Supermajority, which is an amazing intersectional women's organization, is joining forces with groups across the country, from Women's March to Time's Up, to lead a national Get Out the Vote campaign called #WomenAreVoting. And so that's tomorrow. So if you haven't voted yet and you have early voting in your state, go tomorrow. You can also text voting if you've already voted or planning to vote soon. You can text shift to sign up for a virtual volunteer shift this weekend. And you can text plan for helping make your plan to vote. I'm not sure where we're supposed to send it to. That would be a good question. But go to supermajority.com. Really amazing organization doing a lot of great work in getting out the vote. Lastly, I am launching a feminist leadership program where we're going to dive into leadership from an inclusive and empathetic perspective. I have 3 spots left. It is starting November 2nd. If you're interested, you need to apply now. It is a group of amazing women from all over the world. We're going to bond together over an 8-week course and become phenomenal leaders and figure out how to create institutional change on gender equity, find male allies like Gary, turn more men into people like Gary, because if every man were like Gary, the world would just be gender equal. So please, if you're interested, go to my website, empowerglobal.net, go to online challenge, and you can apply there. The applications are closing very soon. And like I said, I only have a couple spots left. Next week, we're going to have a surprise guest. I'm not going to let out who that is yet, but they're going to be great. And then Friday, October 30th, we're going to have Milan Verveer, the first ambassador for global women's issues at the State Department and the head of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. She's going to be coming on the show. She's an incredibly, just unbelievable woman. Talk about somebody who could have been president or secretary of state. It's Milan Verveer. So that's it for tonight. Thanks so much for watching. Share this with your friends. This is a really important conversation. And yeah, thanks for being with us. And I'll see you next week on Samanthropolitics. Take care, everyone.